Awesome. All right, guys, thank you very much for having me. I'm Craig, and today we're going to be talking about thank you, creating GraphQL schemas with the OpenAPI Spec. Maybe. Cool. So give me 1 second to get organized here. All right, so here's the things we're going to cover tonight. This talk is geared towards people who are, have a rudimentary understanding of GraphQL and are pretty excited to use it, but maybe having some trouble convincing team members or managers to use it at work. So we'll briefly go over the OpenAPI spec or Swagger spec, and then we'll walk through how to get a GraphQL service up and running with your existing API using some of this tooling. So a little bit about me first. I'm an engineer at Twilio working on the marketing campaigns product. Oops, too far. Been developing for the web since around 2010, full-time. I think it's 98, like part-time, but and then I've been developing with GraphQL since about 2018. So I'm here today to share some of my knowledge that I picked up over that year. So let's get to it. So a lot of people know, I'm not going to go into so much detail about why we should use GraphQL, but I think we should highlight some of the big ones, the big reasons. So the first is we're consolidating API requests. So if we have a multitude of APIs, we can narrow them down to a single endpoint. And not only that, we can, multiple requests for data can be combined into like a single query. That could be executed in parallel on the server. What else we got? Backend for front end is a good reason. It puts the consumer of the API in full control over what data they receive, ideally in like a single, smaller HTTP request, which prevents querying of unneeded data or overfetching. Another good reason is self-documenting. It's using a single evolving version of the schema by deprecating fields that aren't needed anymore. And lastly, I think it's just great for multiple interfaces. So if you have a web app and iOS and Android, they're all using the same data source. So sounds great, right? But why is this a hard sell to shareholders, to stakeholders? So let me show you. There's a huge learning curve at first, and there's a lot to learn, lots of new concepts. It can be overwhelming. So yeah, you don't have to learn all of this up front, but people look at that pile and think like, whoa, I don't need that. I've got a perfectly good API over there. So how do we prove its value without throwing a lot of resources at it? We build a proof of concept, POC. So just build something, create a quick POC that can demonstrate the value for us. And for this, we have a couple options. We got a greenfield approach, we've got a gateway approach, got a wrapper, and we've got a hybrid. So that's kind of the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So the first one's greenfield. We all like this one. It's the start from scratch approach. Starting over, creating a new GraphQL server that connects directly to a data source. You get to make all the decisions yourself, right or wrong. That's nice, but it's time consuming, and when you're trying to ship features, may not be the easiest thing to justify working on. So I'm not saying it's impossible to convince people of this, but it can be a tough sell. So dog level of effort estimate, it's a Great Dane. It's pretty big. So the next one is the gateway approach. It's where we add a middle tier service in between our GraphQL our browser and our API. So we basically keep our existing APIs, but you point the UI to a GraphQL middle tier. This requires some modeling of your data types in advance. So just to connect your GraphQL schema to the data returned by your APIs. This is sort of tedious and time consuming. If you're already using some kind of DTO or like adapter pattern, that definitely helps. And as you can see, level of effort is, it's a lab. It's kind of a medium size. So the next one is the wrapper approach. This is the one we're going to focus on most today. This is basically just taking the API, the OpenAPI schema, and turning it into a GraphQL schema. It's just a wrapper around your API, basically. Level of effort, it's pretty small. It's teacup Yorkie, not very large effort here. So last one we're going to talk about briefly is the wrapper approach. This is when we generate a GraphQL schema using the OpenAPI schema to build a gateway service. That feels like the wrong, yeah, I didn't update the slide. Really, it's just the browser's going to a service that has this, as well as just the GraphQL. So they kind of sit side by side, and it allows you to basically, build a new GraphQL service while your other one is still functioning. Level of effort here is, oh, I didn't. There it is. We found it. Cool. This one's a Beethoven. This is a big effort too. It's not quite as big as the Great Dane, but there's some work involved. So yeah, we're gonna focus on the wrapper approach of just throwing a OpenAPI schema at our app. So OpenAPI Spec, AOS or OAS, Swagger. You've all heard these terms. They're used kind of interchangeably, but I think the Swagger is now the tooling, whereas the OpenAPI is like the specification. But anyway, basically, it's a way to describe the functionality and behavior of APIs in like a standardized way. So a quick show of hands, how many people have heard of Swagger, OpenAPI? Great. And how many people are actually using it? Good amount, okay. So why would we use it for the people that aren't? It generates documentation for us. It's free, and it's great for collaboration, as well as it's like a rudimentary postman against your existing service. It's all set up for you. You're able to try out requests against a working API. So then how do we do that? There's a couple, many different ways depending on the language you're writing in, your API in. But there's two main ways. There's docs in, code out, and code in, docs out. The first one is like top-down approach, and it's your API is like completely tied to the OAS library that you're using. So you're sort of limited to what that can do. And then the code in, docs out is the bottom-up approach. Basically allows you to write your APIs however you want, and then add the Swagger docs afterwards. So you're writing them independently, which, room for divergence, so you got to be a little careful. And this is just an example of, I think the pet store is like their default example. So that's what it looks like. Cool, so demo time. So I created a demo so we can kind of show how the wrapper approach, works to quickly generate a GraphQL schema using our Swagger docs. So created this. This is an app that connects to an API. Just go there real quick. So we got it here. You can see down here there's 3 different requests. And they connect to a locally running server, which has its own Swagger doc. So I ended up writing this manually, the Swagger doc. It's not super fun. I don't recommend it, but it is possible using the Swagger editor. Ideally, there's some kind of tooling in place in your API. They have ways to like write JS docs and have it generate something, or like TypeScript decorators are great. So, and you can see this does function, which is nice. Get the actual curl and the URL you're calling, as well as actual data from my server. Sorry, where are the slides? There we go. Cool. Great. So that's all fine, and it works great. That's a simple REST API. Now let's try creating a GraphQL service out of the Swagger. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna use IBM's OpenAPI to GraphQL CLI. They have a tool that creates a wrapper service for me, and I already have my API running. So let's get, okay, this is running, and so can you guys see this okay? It's kind of hard to read, actually. So I am inside the directory of my API. This is all local. OAS graph is the CLI, cores is just a flag, and then I'm pointing to my API's Swagger document. And that's it. I got a working instance here. So let's get back to here. This is it right here. It gives us graphical, there we go, out of the box. So we're able to connect directly to our API. We can go and traverse the docs here and check out what's available, what queries are available to us. What's nice is they sort of highlight what the equivalent of the API is, like REST API request would be, and then you get the data model as well. And this does work. So we've got data back. So that's cool. Let's now connect this to our app. So this is the old way of connecting to REST APIs. I've got a service in another file. I'm basically just going to comment this out. Do this one-handed. And comment this guy in. This is the, can you guys see that all right? So this is what I just added here. This is the Apollo version of the request, basically. So save that guy. Got to point to the right server now. Start my app. This is thrilling. And refresh. And we're good to go. Back up and running in no time. That took what, like 30 seconds? Maybe longer. Okay, so now we can see there's only one request. This is the options request because now I'm using cores. But yeah, now I've got all of my data coming in one request as opposed to three. So that's it. That's huge, right? Like, I think another thing we can try here is like, I took the Swagger, I basically, so the Open API to GraphQL library that IBM has is, it does two things. It either wraps a service around your existing service, or it can just generate a schema for you. So I wanted to see what that looked like. So I took their library and kind of created my own little service around it. So I'm going to take my my Swagger doc, drop it in here. Oh, it's still loading. There we go. So this is basically the report that the library gives us, the CLI gives us. There's 6 operations. It tells us how many queries and mutations we made. And then we actually get you get to see what the query, the schema looks like. So if you're not familiar, usually like when we're writing our schemas, where are my slides? There we go. Just jumping ahead, just in case we didn't have Wi-Fi here. Had some slides ready. So the type definitions on the left here, that's usually what we're writing our type definitions as. That's kind of a GraphQL specific format. What things like Apollo are doing under the hood are translating it into this AST or an AST, and then converting that AST to be, able to resolve queries. So that's the result. So it goes from there, ends up in this format. So that is what gets passed to the graphical. Which is what we saw earlier. So it's the same thing. This is just a great way to see, what your API looks like, and get a quick POC up and running. So I guess let's review. We just, back to my slides. So yeah, we leveraged our existing tooling to create a brand new GraphQL service for our existing API. That's the big win here. We consolidated our requests for data down to one endpoint. We minimized browser requests and data processing. And if we take advantage of like fragment caching in Apollo client, for example, like these are measurable performance wins, especially for like a larger app. We now have a backend for front end. So we basically put the UI devs in the driver's seat and gave them the keys. So there's no more agile fall. There's no more like contract negotiating. People can just go build. And then lastly, we upgraded our documentation for both backend and front end. They're all on the same page without having to do extra work. It just works. So there's no divergence of documentation and code. So I think this is a great way to very quickly prove that value of GraphQL and get your coworkers excited about it. That's all I've got. Any questions?
How does it work to like map arguments, like for pagination, for example?
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I can. So the question was, how does it work for mapping arguments, like for pagination? I don't know if I have an answer for that. It's a lot of magic happening. There's they're very open to like pull requests, and they're very like open about the work that they're doing, and specifically it's the OpenAPI library. I can't type with one hand. There's actually links in my slides here. So I think it's in there. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that it has to do with the Swagger document, because that's all the data is modeled there and explained and mapped out. I do know that in some cases you may have to like tweak the Swagger document to get it to work properly. So I can give you an example. It's the pet store example. I can get that Swagger in here.
So OpenAPI support like query string parameters.
The question was, does OpenAPI support query string params?
Yeah, wouldn't that be where the mapping took place? Definition of the
Yeah, I mean that's all from exactly. That's how it works. So I can show you the Swagger. Like for my API, we've got. I took that out. No, I can't show you that. So let's grab this. Drop it in this guy. So this is the example, and you can see there's a bunch of warnings. So it's not perfect.
Sure.
You might have to do some manual tweaking, but it did create the schema basically, so we can see all the pieces to that. Yeah.
Do you know of, or can you recommend a tool that would do the same for like closer to the metal SQL database, or like if you're running Mongoose or Mongo or something, but you don't have the OpenAPI spec in place?
I cannot. The question was, can you recommend a similar tool for like something that doesn't have an OpenAPI spec? And honestly, I just haven't looked. I'm sure they exist out there. I just can't recommend any. Is there another question?
Prisma's a good one.
Sure.
You mentioned the AST. You threw Apollo client there. Is the AST specific to Apollo client, or is that like don't know, standard or something like that?
I think what Apollo does to the AST and what it translates it eventually to, that's the standard. I'm not sure about that, about what the AST is, if that's a standard or not. I can't answer that, unfortunately, but now I'm going to look it up. Does anyone know offhand?
It's part of the GraphQL spec.
That the AST part is? Okay. That makes sense.
Yes, it means abstract syntax tree, and any GraphQL API supports it.
Cool. Anyone else? Great. Well, again, I have some resources here. We'll post the slides somewhere. If you have any questions, hit me up on Twitter. And thanks for having me.